Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. I hope everyone can see me and see my screen. So thank you for joining us on the webinar on the Global Stocktake, and more particularly the monitoring of the financial flows. The webinar will be divided into 3 parts. The first one will be a short presentation of the Global Stocktake and the avenues of work that we thought about at the Sustainable Finance Observatory. Then we will have a roundtable where the participants will give us their take on the limits and opportunities for this exercise. And then we'll have a Q&A session. If you have any question, you can ask them in the Q&A part of the Teams. And first of all, I will let Raphaël Olivier, Director of the Sustainable Finance Observatory, say a few words about this initiative.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for the organization of this webinar and your note about the Global Stocktake. So what's the Sustainable Finance Observatory? For 4 years, the Sustainable Finance Observatory has been launched in France with the objective to track the alignment of the transformation of financial actors on the sustainable finance objective of the Paris Agreement goal. So what we do, we are tracking the commitment of financial actors, and we publish more than 100 indicators about bonds, insurer, SGP, etc. By the end of the year, we will publish analysis about the net zero alignment of the GFN's commitment, and that will be a publication in December. As I told you, we work a lot on the private sectors, but we think about, okay, that's important to track the alignment of private flows, but although from state's perspective, how we could track the alignment of actors and public flows. And that's why we get focused on the Global Stocktake commitment and report. And that's why we wanted to organize this webinar to think about what is the Global Stocktake and how we could use this indicator on this report to have more indicator on the Sustainable Finance Observatory. Because we have this objective to go abroad. From next year, we will start to work on European scale. So it would make sense to have some link with the Global Stocktake. That's about the Sustainable Finance Observatory, and I let you the floor for helping us to understand what is this Global Stocktake and what's the limit.
Okay, thank you for the presentation, Raphaël. So what is the Global Stocktake, and so what is the process of the Global Stocktake? So the Global Stocktake is a 3-year process that takes place every 5 years, and the goal is to track the commitment made by the parties during the signature of the Paris Agreement. Those commitments were first translated in 2015 in their nationally determined contribution. So the NDCs are commitment that each parties take to reduce their green gas emissions. So they have specific targets and steps that they have to respect. And so the Global Stocktake, to monitor those commitments, is divided into 3 phases. So the first one is the data collection and preparation. So the UNFCCs collect synthesis reports, scientific findings to have a global state of emission, adaptation effort, mitigation effort, and the means of implementation, such as the financial flows. Then the second phase is the technical assessment. So the technical assessment is a 3 cycle of dialogues. So they call it technical dialogues, where parties and experts on certain subject gather to review information that they received in the first phase. And those 3 cycles resulted in a synthesis report that was made public on the 8th of September. And now we are currently at the beginning of the third phase. So the first phase is consideration of outputs, where the parties will discuss the finding and next step at political level. So the third phase is beginning officially at the COP28, where they could talk about the synthesis report mainly of the Global Stocktake. And all those discussions for 2 years will amount to the update of the indices in 2025, because the indices have to be updated every 5 years. The parties can also use other reports such as the biennial transparency report that the parties have to submit every 2 years. So the next one is in 2024. So that's for the global process of the Global Stocktake. About the financial flows and the monitoring of the financial flows, the main finding that we have in the synthesis report about the financial flows is that there is a need to scale up mobilization of support for climate action, especially for adaptation and for developing countries, because the developing countries are the first victim of climate change. They need to have a more direct access to finance, to have a more quick answer to quick response to catastrophe that they might have. And the investment also needs to be monitored and tracked to maximize the impact and have more meaningful activities. These scale-up need to be included in the more shifting of the finance as we know it. So in the synthesis report, the Global Stocktakes see that the regulator and public sector created condition, but needs to create more condition to make it easier to finance mitigation and adaptation. They also say that the global capital is sufficient, but it needs to be relocated. So that means that both public and private finance needs to be used to tackle this issue. And more globally, if we want to have a financial response to this issue, we also need to shift the way finance is working and the financial flows. That means that we need to use more blended finance, for instance. So that's when you combine private and public capital. We need to use more innovative financial instrument to have more effectiveness when using finance. So they use to have those findings. They based those data on the fifth biennial assessment and overview of climate financial flows by the UNFCCC. That's every 2 years they publish this report on climate financial flows, and the last one was in 2022. They also use a report from the OECD's and the Standing Committee on Finance. So what data did they use? First of all, they did a take on the financing needs for developing country, but also developer country to achieve those goals. They try to assess the general financial flows for climate action. They divided those data into financing adaptation, financing for mitigation, and cross-cutting activities. They also try to look at how it was distributed between public finance, private finance, and also tools that private and public finance can use, such as subsidies, multilateral banks, and others. They also look at the harmful activities, so to compare the green investment assay and the brown investment, so the investment in fossil fuels mainly. And they also looked at the numbers of policy and regulatory measure. So those kind of investment indicators, are the one that we are looking at the Sustainable Finance Observatory, but we are mainly looking at those indicators for the private sector. And so we thought about some action we can take to use the data that the global assessment, Global Stocktake is using. So the first action we have in mind is to make the data that is presented in the Global Stocktake accessible and comprehensible. So to put it in our website and try to explain what is this data, how it is used, and what is the limit. Then we will try to annualize this work, so to make a yearly review of the data that we can find on the Global Stocktake, but do this work on the European and French scale, because we have a more direct conversation with those institutions. And so the objective is to have the exact same thing that we have for the private sector, but for the public one. And then the third action we have in mind, the third one, is to mobilize the French financial actors to supplement this international monitoring with more ambitious and more precise indicators. So at the Sustainable Finance Observatory, we started 3 years ago this initiative. So we had a lot of discussion about what is the right indicator to use to monitor the financial sector. So we think that we can use this information to also work with the UNFCCC on this Global Stocktake, and more particularly the monitoring of financial flows. So that is the opportunities that we are seeing at the Sustainable Finance Observatory. But now I will turn to the participants of this roundtable, and more particularly Gabriela. You are working at the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment. You are working with the private sector also. So what is the opportunities and the hope you have for the private sector after the Global Stocktake and after the discussion on the COP28?
Thank you very much, Caroline. I hope you can hear me. I understand you probably can't see me. I'm sorry for that, but trying to make it work. Anyway, good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, depending on where you are. So thanks for the invitation. There are several aspects, I think, to the GST which are interesting. First of all, it's like the first global assessment that shows us the gaps and opportunities available. One, I guess, of the positive sides of the GST is that the GST shows that there's lots of initiatives already happening, and we see a lot of interest from the private sector. And we see clearly a gap and a need for shifting the global flows from currently the financial capital is invested in partially harmful technologies or non-aligned, Paris-aligned technologies and sectors, and in geographies primarily in the global north, whereas when we look at the need side, there is a need to shift investment into Paris-aligned sectors and technologies, and also primarily into more into the global south. So we definitely need incentives to facilitate for that. You were mentioning some of that, be it through policy frameworks and or blended finance schemes. So I think that's the public side that we as a public actor are also considering. And then when working with our private sector partners, it's clear we do see an interest, and there's also quite some space for awareness raising around. I think one of the things the GST also clearly showed, you had this circle with the NDCs and the BTRs, the biennial assessments, kind of coming in between the reporting cycle that also feeds into the GST. And what the GST also showed is that there's a certain gap in indicators and data measurements. So the biannual transparency reports under the Paris regime, for example, do not track financial flows at large. They only track public investments especially from the north to the south. They don't track domestic investments, and there's no measurement of like broader financial flow assessments. And so there is in the biannual assessment, you also highlighted that, but not in the country reports. And so that's, for example, one area of improvement that we see, and we hope that the GST will help us on a global scale to come forward with indicators, recommendations, and standards. There's many out there in this private space already, but there's a lack of certain harmonization that we see. So we see some area for improvement in that space. Maybe a limitation of the GST is, well, the mandate of the GST is to be global and non-prescriptive. You cannot drive it down to one particular country, and that's a cornerstone of the mandate of the Global Stocktake. And it has an advantage to it because it allows the global collective to be maybe more forward-leaning than if it were country focused. Because if it were country focused, every country would be just very focused on having itself a good assessment and maybe would then not be ready to be more forward-leaning. But the downside, of course, is that if you try to derive measures moving forward, we can only have global recommendations. There's no country-specific recommendation. So every country itself on a voluntary basis can do that, or actors like you highlighted in your actions, can do that. And we also, of course, hope that private actors themselves will pick this up, and there will be like initiatives, private initiatives, voluntary initiatives, along with it, seeing, okay, these are the gaps identified on a global scale by the GST. This is what we can do in our sector or in our country, and so on. So yeah, there's, I think, maybe some misconception or expectation, especially also from civil society, what the GST can do and what it cannot do due to its mandate, as it's sketched out. Yeah.
And do you have any idea of what in Switzerland, particularly, you might take out of the COP28? Did you prepare for this event? And yeah, do you have specific points on the GST that would be particularly interesting for Switzerland?
Yeah, we just made a submission as environmental integrity group. So Switzerland also chairs the environmental integrity group in the context of the climate negotiations. And it contains a set of recommendations that we would like to see in the GST as an outcome of the GST. And there's a set of recommendations specifically focused on financial flows, which I recommend you to have a look at. It speaks to both of the elements you were also highlighting on your slide. So there's the public side of the need to further scale up the mobilization of financial flows, of increasing international public investments. We see that the 100 billion have so far not been met. So there's a clear need to scale that further up. But then there's also the question of what we do with this enhanced public finance and how we capture the private flows and push this capital, as I mentioned, more into the geographies and sectors that we need. There's specific recommendations around specific sectors, so especially around renewables, and also the need for shifting investments for the transition in the energy sector, and the set of like also phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and things like that. So there's a whole full suite of recommendations in our submission, not just on finance, on all dimensions of the GST. And I think for Switzerland itself, we're very much looking forward to this outcome. We hope it's as ambitious as possible, setting the right signals on a global scale, also particularly for mitigation, but of course also for financial investments. And we will take away whatever comes out of COP28, and we will also use that as an input into how we can improve our NDC moving forward, of course. Whereas the NDC is primarily mitigation focused in the Swiss context, based on the setup of the Paris Agreement. But we're also continuing to push national activities, especially in the financial sector. We have a suite of climate finance meetings actually happening from tomorrow onwards. I'll be going to Geneva after this. Also embedded in the Building Bridges conference, which is a sustainable finance conference, because we really see all the pieces of sustainable finance coming together, moving the whole world towards a more sustainable development.
Okay, thank you for this outputs. Raphaël, you were at previous COP, you will be going to the COP28. What can you expect as a member of the Ministry for the Ecological Transition in France from those discussions at COP28 and from this Global Stocktake?
Thank you very much, Caroline, for the invitation and the introduction. Yes, regarding the GST, my presentation will be very simple. First, the opportunities for tracking financial flows, and then a few limits. You all know this, but I just want to remind a simple fact, because it is important for our topic today. But the problem we face is that most public and private financial flows are directed towards activities that intensively emit carbon emissions or are based on fossil fuels. So basically, this is leading the economy to be locked in with stranded assets. To avoid this economic risk and to support climate action, we must align financial flows with the mitigation and adaptation objectives of the Paris Agreement. This is precisely the aim of Article 2.1C of the Paris Agreement, and this alignment concerns all countries, all companies, all money flows. So this is the general point, but it is important to recall. And so tracking financial flows is first about quantity, about monitoring the amounts that are supporting climate action, but also the amounts that are detrimental to climate action. Just to give a few orders of magnitude, but Caroline and Gabriela already mentioned it, but the fifth biennial report by the Standing Committee on Finance, the SCF, shows that all private and public climate finance represent a drop of around $800 billion in the ocean of trillions that are harmful to the climate. Just to give a few examples, the $900 billion invested in fossil fuels, the $450 billion in fossil fuel subsidies, and so on. And also compared to the investment needs, just $300 billion a year for adaptation in developing countries. So monitoring the current misallocation of capital with respect to mitigation and adaptation objectives is the first thing to do. But if this tracking of the quantitative amounts of money that are good and that are bad for climate action is of course necessary, because we need to make actual progress regarding the alignment of financial flows, it is still insufficient. And this is why we also need to track these flows on the qualitative point of view. So in practical terms, this means tracking domestic policies and international initiatives, public policies, and private practices. Also, to give a few examples, we should look at fossil fuel subsidies, but also policies that are removing them, policies aiming to put a price on carbon, policies or regulation that are guiding the financial sector, policies that are addressing greenwashing. But we should also look at private sector practices, their financial models, their portfolios, their investment criteria. So this is for the financial sector, but more in general, the private sector in different sectors of activity. So at the end of the day, tracking finance flows in the GST should help to mainstream mitigation and adaptation action into every economic and financial decision. And this is for the domestic level and also globally. And this is really a key principle to reach the Paris Agreement objectives. A very important point is that the GST cannot simply be a record of the past, a backward looking way of taking stock. It must also enlighten us in a forward looking way, collectively, so that we can strengthen our climate action and step up international cooperation. So from a strictly financial point of view, the GST should identify concrete aspects that will enable all financial flows to be consistent with the Paris Agreement, so a low carbon and resilient economy. And that's why also Caroline, you were asking me about COP28. This is why we need Article 2.1c to be put on the agenda at COP28 in Dubai, because without a dedicated agenda item on 2.1c, we can't compare tracking methodologies, we can't compare analytical models and tools, we can't have any common dynamic on this ground. So this is really important. And if I can sum up the opportunities for tracking the element of financial flows, the first opportunity is about evaluating commitments, because without monitoring, it is difficult to assess the reality of commitments and from their relevance by themselves, and also the practical implementation. And yeah, it's not about only about this, but it's also about combating greenwashing, and whether public or private. The second opportunity is about facilitating the identification of flows at all levels. Gabriela was talking about this, but it is quite easy to identify flows from concessional public finance, but it still leaves a variety of public or private financing in the dark. So although we often talk about monitoring international flows, it is really important to stress the need for better tracking of national domestic flows, and particularly private flows. The third opportunity, so it is the most important one, but it needs the two previous ones before, but it's about enabling capital to be better allocated. The IPCC 6 report clearly indicates that the resources and capital needed to meet the investments requirements for climate action exist. We have enough money, but this money is not correctly directed, not towards the right actions. So tracking is a first step for this reallocation of capital. And the last, maybe not the last, but the last in my list opportunity is about encouraging reform of financial governance at the international level. And the idea behind this is that developing a rigorous monitoring framework in the GST is one way of signaling a clear political will to make climate action an overarching objective. So this is about the opportunity, and I won't be too long on the limits. The limits to monitoring the element of financial flows lie firstly in what alignment implies for certain countries or certain companies benefiting from the fossil fuel economy, and secondly in the tracking itself. So in other words, the limits to monitoring alignment are firstly a political obstacle, and secondly a technical issue. So far, the European Union have never been able to obtain discussions dedicated to Article 2.1c at COPs. That was a failure at COP27 last year, despite the creation of the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue on Article 2.1c and its complementarity with Article 9. The link with Article 9 was requested by a few developing countries, and some of which are quite difficult to convince that aligning financial flows is key in achieving the scale of investment we need to meet our mitigation and adaptation objectives. So the two workshops planned under this dialogue are supposed to prepare COP28. But as I was saying just before, what we need is to obtain a real dedicated agenda item on this, a negotiation point at COP28 in order to anchor this reflection in the discussion under the UNFCCC. So that's for the short-term political obstacle, but this is not an insurmountable obstacle. It's up to us to convince some countries of the opportunities represented by aligning and monitoring financial flows. In the longer term, we should first work towards a common understanding of what aligning financial flows means. This is why also this agenda item is very much needed to have a common understanding of 2.1c. It's really important. And then from a purely technical point of view, the obstacles are not enormous. We already have a significant amount of data on which to build, and we can always work to complete the missing databases. But l'Observatoire de la Finance Durable is doing a great job on this, and I'm really excited to see the work, looking forward to this clarification of databases also on international side. But then the issue is systematization. But really, to me, that doesn't seem to be such a problem. And in any case, the GST should also be the place for that kind of work. As a general guidance, but you could look at the EU submission also on the UNFCCC portal. But the GST should lead to develop a framework of indicators, tools, analytical models, and tracking system that could support countries and private actors to monitor the implementation of 2.1c. And yeah, that's all for the limit. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for your take on the limits on opportunities. Arnaud, I don't know if the microphone is working. Yeah, okay, it's working. So Arnaud, you're working at WWF, and WWF is putting a constant effort to have good outputs from the COP usually, and I think you're preparing also action for the COP28, and we hope so. And what is the best case scenario for you from the output of the COP28? What is the best thing you can expect from this COP and the Global Stocktake?
Thank you, Caroline, and hi, everyone. It's good to be able to discuss the subject months ahead of COP28. Maybe a word on the process itself. You already presented it, Caroline, but just to flag that it's quite an unprecedented work that goes beyond what IPCC has done before. So it's made of consultation with governments, with business, with indigenous people as well, with farmers, I think. So this assessment is probably the most comprehensive assessment of global climate action we have to date. And it's supposed to reflect back on what we've done and what we've not done enough. And it's also supposed to provide a useful roadmap for, well, combating the climate crisis through the upcoming decade. So for those two reasons, it's really useful that we have this report. But it's only the beginning, and the GST report that we've seen a few days ago is not really the GST itself, and it's all up to governments now to decide on how they will take this into account. So countries, and I think there'll be a meeting in a few days in Abu Dhabi with an option paper, but countries and governments still have to take time to assess and to meet to discuss the contents of this report. And it is really important that to flag that this is all in the hand of governments now, and it's a comprehensive assessment gathering views of civil society, companies, and private businesses as well. So it's really important because Gabriela, you mentioned what GST can do and what GST cannot do. Well, it's now up to governments to do something about it, and this is where we have hopes for the future and for COP28 actually. As you were saying, Caroline, we are involved every COP and even before to make sure the different process on climate adaptation, on the protection of nature, on climate finance in generally speaking, and phasing out of fossil fuels are going the good way. It's been 2 years that we are struggling to make sure the governments commit to phase out of fossil fuel, and we have good reason and high hopes to think that it can happen in the coming months. We've seen difficult conversations in the G20 recently in India, and we are still hoping that based on the assessment made in the GST, that we cannot do any more fossil fuel infrastructure and we cannot do any more investment. It's gonna go in the good direction in COP28. So GST is a part of it. It's gonna be a good roadmap, probably. We hope so, if governments take stock of what's been said into the report. But what we expect from COP28 is a clear path and a clear decision from all governments to commit to phase out of all fossil fuels, as it's made the main issue in climate change, probably, and it has not been taken really seriously in the past 30 years of international climate negotiations. So that's really our great focus. And on this, well, investment and both public and private, and you mentioned part of it, Raphaël, are not going the good way yet. I think it's been more than 10 years, in 2009, that the G20 agreed to phase out the most dirty energy subsidies. And last year, the G20 nations, if we take into account all the investments, spent more than 1.4 trillion in supporting fossil fuel use. It was only for last year's spending. If we take into account all the private and public spending harmful for both climate and for biodiversity, I think it goes up to 1.8 trillion or something like that. And it's really, you stressed it, Raphaël, a bit, but it's also a really important battle for us, that even before putting more money on the table for climate and for renewable energy, we start stopping funding with public spending, trillions of public spending that end up being harmful for climate and biodiversity. So that's going to be our main hope, that for COP28 is that this GST moment that is based on both companies, financial, governments consultation, goes into the end of government, and that they are able to build up a clear ambitions to phase out of fossil fuel in 2 months from now.
And what limits can you see on the Global Stocktake and the process of the Global Stocktake?
Well, I think my colleagues here on the panel are probably more aware of that than me, but than I am. But it's going to be put in the end of government. So the limits are the same as when we talk about phasing out fossil fuels. It's going to be probably a strong position from companies or even sometimes producer countries. And that's where the European Union, France, have to come to COP28 with a clear strategy to say, well, we are aware that you are still producing a lot of fossil fuel, that companies rely on it. But what we've done on our side is to reduce the demand substantially with climate policy set by the EU. The carbon tax at the borders of the EU is an example of this. But with a set of different climate policies, EU and France probably have started to reduce the demand, and that's where they need to be probably more convincing at COP28 to say, we are really serious about tackling down our demand on fossil. So you should be really serious in front of us to reduce production and to eventually phase out.
Thank you. Do you, maybe Gabriela or Raphaël, do you have any last words or remarks about what other participants were saying before we move to the Q&A session to other participants?
Not really. I can just say that I largely agree with many things that Raphaël and Arnaud were saying, okay. Especially also around the agenda item and the need to really push this agenda forward. But I have to say it will be very challenging due to the very difficult position of the like-minded developing countries, i.e. the fossil fuel producing developing countries.
Yeah. Raphaël, do you have something No,
nothing to say. Also
okay.
quite agreeing with my colleagues, so all good.
Okay. So we can go to the Q&A session. Does anyone have question? You can write it in the Q&A part of the Teams or raise your hand and I can activate the microphone. I don't know if anyone has question to the participants on the Global Stocktake. Yes, Raphaël. Yeah.
So I start because the frustration is always the hardest. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very interesting. I would like to come back in one of the limits, Gabriela, you told about, and it's an interesting question. You said one of the limits was that we'll not have a report by country. My question is pretty simple. Do you think maybe your country could be interested to be volunteer after this first global report to have a publication of their own country? And the question can work for Raphaël as well, for France. Do you think that is possible and how it would be possible? Because we are open to do it in the observatory, of course. So maybe Gabriela first.
Happy to respond. Trying my camera again. Probably still don't see me. Anyway, yeah, it's a difficult question, and our civil society, the WWF Switzerland was involved, and some others did like an independent GST, I think they called it, where they try to like focus on specific sectors in specific countries and do a GST just for that particular sector and country. And they did look at the financial sector of Switzerland. WWF Switzerland did, and there's some interesting findings in that, which we of course also take a look at and incorporate in our work as far as we can moving forward. I think from the administration side, we wouldn't have it as a priority as a next step to do a GST report for Switzerland itself. I think we would be happy to receive something like this from a think tank or a civil society organization. But our priority will be to prepare the next NDC building on the findings of the GST and using I also have to say that politically, sometimes global recommendations help politically to push politicians to move forward in a direction which they might not be able to if it were national recommendations. It sounds a bit weird and strange sometimes, but it's less of a, if we move in a certain direction, it's more of a activity and action from Switzerland itself and less of a like international organization telling us what to do, which sometimes politically, and especially in our country, there is a certain resistance of the people if there is a certain level of directiveness from international organizations telling us little Switzerland what to do. Whereas if it's a global recommendation, there may be higher uptake. I don't know if it's the same in other countries, but it's a very, very, very typical behavior in Switzerland, I would say.
To answer your question, Raphaël, but first, I totally agree with what Gabriela just said. And to complement, so we should show the added value of having another report than the one made by the co-facilitators. And but why not? I mean, let's see. But more important, showing the added value regarding the content of the CMR5 decision structure text in itself, because we maybe should have everything in it. But I mean, why not exploring the possibility? But for sure, showing that this added value and letting behind the administrative process of validation of that, because of course this is not in my hand.
Thank you. I think it answers your question. Mathieu, you have a question. I will allow the microphone. I think you can speak.
Yeah, yes,
yeah, okay.
Yes, I can speak now. Thank you for the presentation and for the discussion. I have a more specific question for private financial flows and the GFunds framework. And I don't know what are the link between the GST process and what can be done by the GFunds, and maybe to gather information at financial institution level and to have some norms and way to provide elements on the tracking of financial flows.
Happy to respond. Thanks for this question. So there's no formal link between GFunds and the Global Stocktake, but for example, in our submission of the EIG, we refer to GFunds in multiple spots because it's one of the most important alliances in our view, linked to private sector commitments and Paris alignment 1.5 degrees. And an important source of information. I think also the activities around the NCDPU, so the Net Zero Data Public Utility, are really important, and we push for that very much. And we hope also to get, we won't get a recommendation saying, you know, in the future, all private sector actors should follow GFunds and use the NCDPU or something like that. It's absolutely impossible that, for example, Saudi Arabia would agree to something like this. But I do think, and we do hope that at least in the reports and in the discussions around the GST and moving forward, also under the hopefully have a new agenda item on Article 2.1c, we will be able to have these conversations and have a general recommendations around the need for global standards and guidance around reporting and data collection. And then we would expect GFunds and other alliances in that space to engage on that specific recommendation and also provide the solutions you already have and show what you've been doing. And because we've also been arguing that we don't have to reinvent the wheel, but build on what's there and just try to give some guidance around harmonization, knowing that the data available right now is just very scattered and sometimes, multiple actors measure the same things but in different ways, and it would be helpful if we would all kind of follow similar methodologies and metrics. Thanks.
Raphaël or Arnaud, do you wish to answer to this question as well?
No, nothing to add in specifics, but just on the last thing, it's just echoing what I was saying about the need for the 2.1c agenda item and the need to have a common understanding of this really, I mean, this is the third objective of the Paris Agreement. This is not like a mere footnote. So yes, we need to have a clear conversation on that and having the support of non-party stakeholders in also the promotion and the engagement on that point, on that fight, in fact.
Just the 2 lines beyond the proper negotiation track and that have been well mentioned by Gabriela and Raphaël. Probably, as we see it from an NGO perspective, it's really important that the companies and private, any financial institution get there and raise their voice before COP28 to make sure the governments also realize that they have the support needed to be more ambitious in the decisions. So that's where we try to bring a coalition of companies or a financial institution or raise their voice together with ours to make sure outside of the proper negotiation track to make sure that politically the subject gains political traction and that head of states or head of governments can be more ambitious or they feel allowed to because the private sector is also here to back them.
Does anyone have any other question to the participants? Although I think it was a good word of Raphaël, you have a question.
Because we have some time, I just want to ask maybe Arnaud about this last information. So how could we help maybe to mobilize more financial actors and company, because that's the goal of Institut de la Finance Durable, to have this kind of discussion. And so, like, how are you engaging these companies and financial institutions, and are you facing some issue, and how could we help to make this engagement of actors who are engaged?
Thank you, Raphaël. Well, we have different scale of action. We are at WWF, a network with different offices around the world, and also a WWF International that pilots the whole mobilization of companies. But I think we recently launched a coalition for companies willing to join the call for phasing out fossil fuels. So this is something will gain probably media and political traction in the coming months, and I could forward the information if that's of interest to you or any of your members here. On the other side, at the French level, we are working as WWF with different companies to make sure that they are willing to progress on the environment, and we are developing programs with those companies. And sometimes for specific political decisions or international meeting, we allow our different voices to call for more ambition from the government or from the international community. So it happened last year with COP27. It was happening at the time when back in France we would discuss a bill on accelerating the pace of deployment for renewable energies, and we discussed with different companies on the energy sector the way to raise our voice to make sure France goes in a more ambitious way for wind and solar power, and we made a common call for this. So it happens that for specific events or specific decisions, we also gather our voices to raise attention. So that could be also a way to act together. And that's it. Thank you.
I think if there is no more question, we can end this webinar. If you have last word you would like to say, Raphaël, Gabriela, and Arnaud, about this initiative, maybe one sentence to say before the COP28 about this initiative.
Well, maybe just to say the GST is one of the most important outcomes of COP28, and we really hope we can gather the momentum for increased ambition, since this is probably one of the last points to shift emissions to still make the 1.5 degrees. So it's a very important moment in the context of the Paris Agreement.
Just a word, not on the negotiations, but maybe on the link between the technical process of the GST and the political phase. The work Observatoire de la Finance Durable is doing is really important in that regard. So yeah, just telling you that we are very, very interested in that, and hope that we could have a good CMA5 decision text in Dubai, and you can count on us on to have an incredible effort in that direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Arnaud, do you have a last sentence you'd like to say?
Thank you. No, it's just good to see the interest from the Institut de la Finance Durable and different members. It's really nice to see this few months ahead of what we see as an important COP. Another issue we've not mentioned, I've not been mentioning here, is the biodiversity issue. We have quite strong expectations from COP28, which is a climate COP, but on biodiversity as the two crises are quite well intermingled and more and more. So yeah, maybe that's going to be the subject of another discussion, but this is also something where we are happy to see interest from other sectors.
Yes, Institut de la Finance Durable is working also on the biodiversity subject, and we think that the COP28 will be an extremely interesting moment also for biodiversity, and we hope to see more biodiversity in the discussion. So thank you everyone for joining us today and for this webinar. Thank you to all the participants who intervened during this webinar and for giving us your take on the limits and opportunities of the Global Stocktake. And do not hesitate, if you would like to learn more about the Global Stocktake, to see the note, the paper we wrote on our website. And if you have any question, you can also send the question on the website. I think we have a contact page. So thank you, everyone, and have a nice day.